Rich Cowboy didn't want a wife until she collapsed in the snow outside his stable. Jack Harris lived alone on the vast Harris Ranch, a sprawling piece of land nestled in the rolling hills of Montana. His ranch was famous in the county, not because it was the largest, though it was, or because he had the best cattle, though he did, but because Jack himself was a man of mystery and reputation. People spoke of him with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered by years of outdoor work, Jack had the kind of presence that made people either admire him or steer clear. He was known for his skill with horses, his sharp mind in business, and his stubborn independence. From a young age, Jack had learned the value of hard work. His father had been a strict man, teaching him that the land and the cattle came before anything else. A man who can't care for his land can't care for anything else, his father had often said, and Jack had taken it to heart. When he inherited the ranch after his parents passed away, he threw himself into it completely. Days were long and cold, with early mornings feeding the cattle and late nights repairing fences or checking the barns. Friends and neighbors often invited him to dinners, dances, and gatherings, but Jack always declined. He preferred the quiet company of his own thoughts, the rhythmic sounds of the ranch, and the predictable comfort of his daily routines. People in town whispered that he was a man who didn't want a wife. Many had tried to match him with women from nearby towns, some even brought to his doorstep by well-meaning family members. But Jack had always politely but firmly refused. "I like my life the way it is," he would say, tipping his hat with a small, polite smile. Women found him charming but distant, his eyes always carrying a seriousness that seemed to hint he didn't have room for love. Jack never explained why he avoided marriage. He just knew that a quiet, solitary life suited him best. The ranch itself was a reflection of Jack's personality. The barns were spotless, the fences solid, and the stables smelled faintly of hay and leather. His prized horses, each trained with patience and care, roamed freely across the land, and his cattle were healthy and well-fed. Every corner of the property was orderly, yet alive with movement and energy. Jack loved it that way. He loved the predictability, the rhythm of work, and the sense of control he had over the land. Even though Jack kept to himself, he wasn't unkind. He would help neighbors when they needed him, mend fences for the elderly, or bring a wagon of hay to someone struggling through the winter. People respected him, even if they didn't understand him. Children in the village sometimes came by to watch him work, wide-eyed as he handled the horses or roped a calf with precision. He never minded their presence. If anything, he enjoyed seeing curiosity and determination in young faces. But Jack never lingered. He was a man of action, not conversation. Winter in Montana was harsh. The cold crept through the valleys, blanketing the hills in snow and frosting every tree and fence post. Jack had spent many winters alone, trudging through the snow to feed his livestock, checking fences, and keeping the horses warm. Some nights he would sit by the fire in the small cabin attached to the main barn, sipping hot coffee and staring at the dancing flames. The wind would howl outside, rattling the windows and swirling snow across the land, but inside, Jack felt at peace. He liked the solitude, the quiet moments when he could hear only the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the animals in the stables. Despite his contentment, Jack sometimes wondered what life might have been like with someone by his side. But these thoughts were fleeting. He had seen too many people depend on others and then be disappointed, and he had no desire to share his life with someone who might leave or change. His independence was something he cherished, and he wasn't willing to sacrifice it. Love, he told himself, was a complication he didn't need. On a particular January morning, the sun rose slowly over the frost-covered hills. Jack was already outside, feeding the horses and checking the cattle. The cold air stung his cheeks, and his breath formed clouds in front of him. He hummed softly to himself, a tune his mother had once sung as he moved from stall to stall. Each horse knew him, nuzzling his shoulder or nudging his hand for treats. It was moments like this that made him appreciate his life, the quiet communication between man and animal, the sense of trust and routine. After finishing with the horses, Jack walked toward the main barn to check the feed. Snow crunched under his boots, and the air smelled of pine and earth. He paused for a moment, looking out over the land, and allowed himself a rare feeling of contentment. This was his world, his creation, and it ran smoothly under his careful watch. There were no arguments, no misunderstandings, no disappointments, just the land, the animals, and him. Jack's days passed in this rhythm. Work, care for the animals, repair, and solitude. He rarely spoke more than necessary, and visitors to the ranch were few and far between. Yet there was a quiet pride in the life he had built. He thought about the village sometimes, about the people who watched him from a distance, and he understood that they didn't quite get him. But he didn't need them to. He had everything he wanted. As the sun began to dip behind the hills that evening, Jack finished his chores and went back to the cabin. He stoked the fire, made himself a simple supper, and listened to the wind outside. The ranch was silent except for the occasional whistle of the wind and the soft sounds of the animals settling in for the night. Jack sat back, hands clasped in front of him, and allowed himself a small, private smile. Life was not complicated, it was not noisy, and it was not messy. It was perfect in its own way, and Jack liked it just as it was. Little did he know that his quiet, orderly world was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. A single winter night, a single unexpected event, would soon disrupt the life he had so carefully built, and force him to reconsider the one thing he had always refused, the idea of a companion, a partner, a wife. But for now, he had no way of knowing that the life he cherished so dearly was about to intersect with someone else's, someone whose presence would shake his routines, warm his heart, and challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. Jack Harris, the wealthy, stubborn, independent cowboy, was content with his solitude, but life, as it often does, had a way of introducing surprises in the most unexpected ways. That winter evening, as he stoked the fire and sipped his coffee, the snow fell silently outside the cabin, hiding what was soon to come, something that would test Jack in ways he had never imagined, something that would leave him questioning his long-held beliefs about love, trust, and the warmth of another human being by his side. The next morning, Jack woke to a world transformed. Overnight, the ranch had been blanketed in snow, thick and sparkling under the pale winter sun. Every fence post, every tree, and even the roof of the barn was covered in a thick layer of white. The wind had calmed, leaving the hills still and silent. Jack wrapped his thick coat tightly around himself and stepped outside to begin his usual morning chores. The cold bit at his cheeks, but he was used to it. He had spent decades working in Montana winters and knew how to move with purpose, keeping the chill at bay. As he approached the stables, he noticed something unusual. Near the far corner where the old maple tree stood, there was a figure slumped in the snow. At first, Jack thought it might be a deer or some other animal caught in the storm, but as he drew closer, his eyes widened in surprise. It was a young woman, lying face down in the snow, her hair dusted with frost. Her movements were faint, barely perceptible, and she shivered violently. She looked as though she had fallen or perhaps collapsed in the bitter cold. Jack's heart raced, not out of fear, but out of concern. He had never seen anyone in such a state in all his years on the ranch. Without hesitation, he strode forward, carefully lifting her into his strong arms. She was surprisingly light, though her body trembled from the cold. "Easy, easy now," he murmured, speaking softly to calm her. His voice was deep and steady, the kind of voice that could bring comfort even in fear. He carried her into the barn, where the warmth of the horses and the enclosed space protected her from the freezing air. Setting her gently on a pile of clean blankets, Jack quickly pulled another thick quilt around her. He took a wet cloth and tried to warm her hands and face, rubbing gently to stimulate circulation. The young woman stirred faintly, groaning as she regained some awareness, but her eyes remained closed. Jack worked methodically, bringing her small sips of warm water from a tin cup and speaking in low, encouraging tones. "You're safe now. Just rest." He noticed that her clothes were thin for the winter, wet from the snow, and that she had no shoes. Whoever she was, she must have been traveling in dangerous conditions. He didn't ask questions yet. First, she needed warmth and care. Hours passed, and the young woman slowly opened her eyes. They were wide, a striking shade of green that seemed almost luminous in the dim light of the barn. For a moment she looked confused, as if trying to understand where she was. Then her gaze met Jack's, and she shivered again. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice fragile. "You're safe," Jack said firmly, though kindly. "You were out in the snow. That's dangerous. You could have frozen. I'm Jack. This is my ranch. You need to rest." The woman tried to speak more but could only manage a faint nod. Jack realized she was exhausted, likely from wandering in the snow for hours, or perhaps even days. He didn't push her for answers. Instead, he prepared a simple meal, warm broth, bread, and a hot drink to restore some of her strength. She ate slowly, her hands still shaking, but with each bite, she seemed to regain a little of her energy. As she ate, Jack noticed her clothing more carefully. She was dressed in a travel coat and worn boots, but everything was soaked and covered in frost. She clearly hadn't planned to be caught in such a storm. "You were walking in this weather?" he asked, a hint of concern in his voice. She nodded, her lips trembling. I was trying to reach the next town," she said softly. "I lost my way in the snowstorm. I didn't think anyone would find me." Jack frowned slightly. It was unusual for anyone to venture into the hills in such a storm, especially alone. Most travelers stayed in town or sought shelter. Yet here she was, and now she depended on him. For a brief moment he considered turning her away, reminding himself that he preferred solitude. But seeing her so fragile and shivering, he knew he couldn't do that. "Not this time. You're going to stay here until you're well," he said firmly. "I can't let you wander back into that storm. You're lucky I found you." The young woman looked at him with wide, grateful eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. She didn't protest, only nodded again, and Jack felt a small flicker of relief. He had done what he could, and for now, that was enough. Over the next few days, Jack tended to her carefully. He gave her dry clothes, made her comfortable in the warm barn, and kept her fed. She gradually regained her strength, sitting by the fire for long hours while Jack worked outside with the animals. She asked little about the ranch or Jack's life, and Jack didn't ask much about hers. For both of them, silence was comfortable, a quiet understanding in the stillness of winter. Jack noticed things about her that intrigued him. Her hands were delicate but strong, hinting at a life of work or travel. Her eyes, though often weary, carried determination. And despite everything she had been through, she had a quiet resilience that impressed him. She wasn't fragile in the way people often assumed. She was enduring, surviving, and even now trying to regain her balance in a harsh world. The villagers began to notice something different about Jack. When they passed the ranch, they saw movement in the barn, smoke curling from the chimney more than usual, and sometimes glimpsed the young woman's figure near the fire. Rumors began to swirl, as they always did. Who was she? Why was she there? And why did the lone, stubborn Jack Harris, who never wanted a wife, allow her to stay? Jack ignored the whispers. He was a private man, and the outside world had little influence on his decisions. But inside he felt something unfamiliar, a sense of responsibility, of concern that went beyond simple kindness. He had saved her life, yes, but he was beginning to care for her well-being in a way he hadn't felt for anyone else in years. One evening, as snow continued to fall softly outside, Jack found her sitting near the fire, staring into the flames. "I don't even know your name," he said gently. Leaning against the doorframe, she looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Clara?" she replied. "Clara Whitmore." "Clara," Jack repeated, tasting the name. It had a nice sound, soft and strong at the same time. "Well, Clara, you're safe here. That's what matters." She nodded, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Why? Why are you helping me? You barely know me." Jack shrugged, though inside he felt the weight of the question. "Because no one should die in the snow," he said simply. "And because, well, you needed help. That's reason enough." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond forming not through words, but through shared experience. She had been alone, terrified, and near death, and he had brought her back to safety. That act, small in his eyes, had already changed something in both of them. Days turned into weeks, and Clara recovered her strength. She began to help with small chores around the barn, feeding the animals, cleaning stalls, and tending to the horses. Jack watched her carefully, amazed at how quickly she adapted to life on the ranch. She asked questions about the animals, about the land, and about the routines that Jack had followed for years. In a way, her presence brought a new energy to the ranch, a warmth that had been missing from Jack's carefully controlled life. Jack realized that he didn't mind her there. More than that, he began to enjoy her company. Her laughter, though quiet at first, brought lightness to the barn. Her questions forced him to explain things he had taken for granted, and her curiosity reminded him of the world beyond his land. He had spent so long in isolation that he hadn't realized how much he had missed connection, not just with people, but with someone who could challenge him, inspire him, and bring warmth to the cold. And yet, Jack's stubbornness remained. He reminded himself constantly that he didn't want a wife, didn't need companionship beyond what he had with the animals and the land. But each evening, as he sat by the fire after a long day, he found himself glancing toward Clara, wondering how she was, hoping she was comfortable, and secretly enjoying the simple sound of her presence. For the first time in years, Jack Harris felt the stirrings of something he had long denied, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, life could be richer with another person by his side. But for now, he kept these thoughts to himself, unsure what they meant, and unwilling to let them disrupt the careful order of his life. He only knew that Clara Whitmore, the young woman he had rescued from the snow, had changed his world in ways he could not yet explain. And that change was only beginning. Winter had settled deeply over the Harris ranch. The snow covered every corner of the property in a thick, unbroken blanket, and the world beyond the hills seemed silent and still. Jack and Clara had settled into a quiet rhythm together, though Jack's stubbornness and solitude still lingered like an invisible wall between them. Clara had begun helping with the daily chores. Each morning she woke early with Jack, bundled in layers of warm clothing, and assisted him with the cattle. She carried buckets of feed, brushed the horses, and learned quickly how to check the fences for damage. Jack watched her carefully as she worked, impressed by her determination and attention to detail. She was strong, capable, and yet gentle with the animals. She asked questions not because she was inexperienced, but because she wanted to understand the rhythm of ranch life, a rhythm Jack had taken decades to perfect. "You have a good way with the horses," Jack remarked one frosty morning, handing her a brush. "Most people don't know how to calm them properly." Clara smiled, brushing a sleek brown mare with practiced strokes. "I've always loved animals," she replied softly. They make the world feel simpler somehow." Jack nodded, though he said nothing further. He preferred to show appreciation through action rather than words. Still, inside, a small warmth spread in his chest. He wasn't used to noticing another person so closely, and even less used to feeling satisfaction from their accomplishments. But Clara had a way of quietly impressing him without even trying. As the days passed, their interactions became more natural. Jack no longer needed to constantly remind Clara about safety or chores. She had learned quickly and was reliable. But in the evenings, she helped him prepare the animals for the cold night ahead, feeding and bedding them, and he began to enjoy the moments of quiet conversation by the fire. They would sit together, sometimes speaking about small things, the weather, the animals, or events in the nearby village, and sometimes sitting in silence, letting the firelight fill the room. Despite her presence, Jack's stubborn nature remained. He still reminded himself daily that he didn't need a companion, that he preferred his life alone. He valued order and routine, and he feared the chaos that emotional attachment might bring. Yet he couldn't deny the comfort he felt when Clara was near. He found himself noticing her laugh, the way she tilted her head when she was curious, or the simple determination in her eyes. One morning, a heavy snowstorm swept across the ranch. The wind howled and snowdrifts formed quickly, making it nearly impossible to see beyond a few yards. Jack and Clara worked together to secure the cattle in the barns, moving through the storm with careful steps. Clara's coat was already dusted with frost, her cheeks red from the cold, but she didn't complain. Instead, she focused on her tasks, following Jack's instructions and offering suggestions when appropriate. "You've learned quickly," Jack said, shouting over the roar of the wind. "Most people wouldn't manage in this weather, not alone." Clara laughed softly, a sound that carried over the wind. "I'm not most people," she replied, ducking into the barn. "And I've got a good teacher." Jack's lips twitched in the beginnings of a smile, though he quickly returned to work. Her presence challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was used to being the sole authority on the ranch, but now he found himself considering her opinions, respecting her instincts, and even relying on her help. It was a strange feeling, one that made him simultaneously uneasy and deeply grateful. After the storm passed, they worked together to repair broken fences and clear snow from the barnyard. Clara's energy never seemed to wane, while Jack's grew tired from constant effort. He watched her carefully, silently thankful for her help. Yet each glance at her reminded him that he was beginning to feel something more than simple gratitude, a realization that made him uneasy. He had always resisted the idea of marriage, of sharing his life with another person, but Clara's presence was slowly changing the landscape of his heart. One evening after a long day of work, They sat by the fire in the cabin. Clara had removed her wet boots and wrapped herself in a warm blanket, while Jack poured steaming cups of coffee. The fire crackled, casting a golden glow across the room. For a moment, they simply sat together in silence, listening to the distant howl of the wind outside. "You never told me why you live out here alone," Clara said softly, breaking the silence. Her eyes met his, curious but gentle. Jack paused, taking a sip of his coffee before replying. "I've always liked things a certain way," he said simply. "The land, the animals, it's a life I understand. People, they're more complicated." Clara nodded thoughtfully, understanding but not pressing further. "I can see that," she said. "But maybe some things are worth the complication." Jack looked at her, surprised by the quiet wisdom in her words. He wanted to argue, to insist that solitude was simpler, safer. Yet a small part of him, the part he rarely acknowledged, wondered if she was right. He turned his gaze to the fire, letting the heat fill him as he considered the idea of change, of something unexpected entering his carefully controlled life. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened, though in subtle ways. Clara brought laughter into the barnyard, joking when the horses were stubborn or the cattle refused to cooperate. Jack found himself smiling more often, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He began to look forward to her presence, noticing when she arrived each morning and feeling a faint disappointment when she left for errands in town. Despite the growing connection, Jack still struggled with his feelings. He reminded himself constantly that he didn't want a wife, that love was unpredictable and could bring disappointment. Yet the more he saw Clara's resilience, her kindness, and her quiet strength, the more he found himself questioning his long-held beliefs. He realized that he cared for her not just because she was helpful, but because he genuinely admired her spirit. He respected her, trusted her, and slowly, without even realizing it, began to feel something deeper. One day, while tending to the horses, Jack noticed Clara struggling to lift a heavy bale of hay. Without thinking, he stepped forward and took one end, steadying the load. "You don't have to do everything alone," he said quietly. Clara smiled, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I can manage," she said softly. "But thank you." Jack nodded, the words feeling heavier than usual. It wasn't just gratitude he felt. It was something more profound, a stirring in his chest that he hadn't anticipated. He quickly turned back to the horses, trying to hide the sudden awareness of his own emotions. Days turned into weeks, and Clara's presence became an inseparable part of life on the ranch. Jack's routines adapted to include her, whether he admitted it or not. He found himself seeking her opinion on tasks, sharing small stories about his past and even laughing at her jokes. Small, quiet moments that filled the spaces of his once solitary existence. And yet, beneath it all, Jack's stubbornness lingered. He still refused to think about love or marriage seriously, still reminded himself that he didn't need anyone beyond the ranch and the animals, but he couldn't ignore the truth. Clara had changed his life in ways he didn't fully understand. Her laughter, her courage, and her quiet presence had begun to break down the walls he had built around his heart. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Jack found himself sitting closer to Clara by the fire than usual. She looked up at him with a curious expression. "You've changed," she said quietly, almost a whisper. "Since I've been here, you're not the same man I first met." Jack looked at her, surprised by the observation. "Maybe some changes aren't bad," he admitted, his voice low. "Maybe they're necessary." Clara smiled, a warmth in her eyes that made Jack's heart race. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder what life could be like with someone by his side. not just for survival, not just for help, but for companionship, for friendship, for love. That night, Jack went to bed thinking about Clara, about the changes she had brought into his life, and about the walls he had always built around himself. He didn't know what the future held, but he realized that for the first time in years, he was beginning to hope. Hope that life could be richer, warmer, and fuller than he had ever imagined. And with that quiet hope, the Harris Ranch, once a place of solitude and routine, began to feel like a home, a place where two lives could meet, grow, and perhaps, in time, thrive together. The winter seemed to grow harsher with each passing day. Snow fell steadily over the Harris Ranch, covering the hills in thick white blankets that sparkled under the pale winter sun. The animals were fed and sheltered, but Jack could feel the tension in the air, a warning that the weather was about to worsen. He had lived through many Montana winters, and his instincts told him that a serious storm was coming. "Clara, come inside for a minute," Jack called as she finished brushing the horses. Her cheeks were rosy from the cold, and her hair had tiny snowflakes clinging to the ends. "I'm almost done, Jack," she replied, tying the last horse to the stable post. "The storm isn't too bad yet."
Jack shook his head.
"It's coming. I can feel it in the air." "Better safe than sorry." He handed her a thick blanket. "Take this. We need to prepare the barn and the cattle before it hits hard." Clara accepted the blanket and followed him, helping to check the fences, secure the feed, and ensure the animals were protected from the wind and snow. They moved quickly, their breaths forming clouds in the freezing air. The sky was already darkening, clouds rolling in fast and low over the hills. Within an hour, the wind had picked up, carrying icy gusts that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. By mid-afternoon, the blizzard had arrived. Snow whipped across the ranch, covering everything in a thick, white haze. The animals were restless, sensing the change in the weather. Jack and Clara worked side by side, moving cattle into the barn, double-checking the horses and making sure there were no weak spots in the fences. The storm was relentless, and the cold was biting, but neither of them stopped. "Hold this rope steady," Jack shouted over the roar of the wind as a frightened cow tried to break free from the pen. Clara grabbed the rope, her hands numb but steady, and held it tight. Together, they guided the animals safely into the barn. Once the last of the cattle were secured, Jack and Clara stepped back, breathing heavily and covered in snow. The storm was at its peak now, a swirling wall of white and wind that made it almost impossible to see. "We need to stay inside the barn," Jack said, his voice tense but calm. "It's safer. The wind can kill you if you're exposed too long." Clara nodded, shivering as they entered the barn. She hung her wet coat on a hook and pulled another blanket around herself. Jack built a small fire near the back of the barn using dry wood, and the warmth slowly began to chase away the chill from their fingers and toes. As they settled near the fire, Jack watched Clara carefully. She was exhausted, but her eyes were bright with determination. He felt a strange mix of admiration and concern. He had always been alone in moments like this, relying only on himself. But now, having someone else depending on him, and whom he cared deeply for, made the responsibility heavier, more meaningful. The blizzard raged outside for hours. Snow piled high against the barn walls, and the wind howled like a wild animal. Jack checked the animals repeatedly, making sure they were safe, while Clara assisted whenever she could. Each time he saw her courage and calmness, his respect and admiration for her grew. She was not just surviving, she was helping others survive too. At one point, a strong gust of wind blew open one of the barn doors, and a few of the cattle became startled Jack rushed to calm them, shouting instructions, while Clara held another rope tightly, guiding the frightened animals back to safety. Her hands were red and raw from the cold, but she didn't complain. Jack's heart tightened with a feeling he didn't expect. Seeing her brave and strong in the storm, he realized how much he depended on her, not just for help, but for reassurance, for companionship, for something deeper. After several hours, the storm began to lessen, the wind dying down to a soft whistle, and the snow settling in thick, silent layers. Jack and Clara were both tired, covered in snow, but alive and safe. They moved around the barn, checking the animals one last time before sitting near the fire to warm up. "You are amazing today," Jack said quietly, his voice low as he watched Clara sip a cup of hot tea. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Clara looked up at him, her green eyes meeting his. "We did it together," she said softly. "I couldn't have managed alone, and neither could you." Jack's chest tightened. He had always prided himself on his independence, on handling everything alone. Yet, in that moment, he realized he didn't want to be alone anymore. He didn't just appreciate her help, he appreciated her courage, her determination, her kindness. Everything about her was changing the way he saw life. He didn't speak immediately, unsure how to put his feelings into words. Instead, he watched her as she adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, feeling warmth that wasn't just from the fire. A part of him, the part he had kept locked away for years, wanted to tell her, to admit that he was no longer content with solitude. But fear held him back. Fear of change, of vulnerability, of losing control of the life he had always managed perfectly. The hours passed, and Clara grew drowsy, curling up near the fire. Jack remained awake, keeping watch over the barn and the animals. He thought about the storm, about the risk they had faced together, and about the realization that had come to him. He didn't just care for her well-being. He cared for her entirely. Her presence filled a space in his heart that he had long ignored, a space that he had assumed would remain empty forever. When the fire burned low, Jack finally allowed himself to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Clara, I need to tell you something." She stirred, opening her eyes and looking at him. "What is it?" she asked softly, sensing the seriousness in his tone. Jack hesitated, searching for the right words. I've spent so many years alone," he began. "I thought I liked it that way. I thought I didn't need anyone. But seeing you today and these past weeks, I realize I was wrong. I care about you more than I ever expected to care about anyone." Clara's eyes widened slightly, and then she smiled, a small, gentle smile that warmed Jack's heart. "Jack, I care about you too," she whispered. "I wasn't sure at first, but I've come to feel at home here, with you." The weight on Jack's chest lifted slightly, replaced by a warmth he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a life with her, not just surviving together, but living fully, sharing the days and nights, facing challenges side by side. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As the night settled over the ranch, the blizzard outside reduced to a soft snowfall, Jack and Clara remained near the fire. They talked quietly about the events of the day, about the animals, about small things in life that seemed important now. Jack felt a sense of connection he had never known before, a bond forged not only in shared work, but in shared survival and trust. By the time they finally went to bed, the barn was quiet, the animals settled, and the storm completely passed. Jack lay awake for a long while, thinking about Clara, about the storm, and about the changes taking place within himself. He realized that life, even in its harshest moments, could bring unexpected blessings. Sometimes, the coldest storms revealed the warmest truths. Jack Harris, the stubborn, independent cowboy who had never wanted a wife, now found himself longing for something he had spent decades avoiding: companionship, love, and a partner who could face life's storms with him. And for the first time, he allowed himself to hope that the future could hold more than solitude. It could hold warmth, laughter, and love. That night, as the snow drifted softly outside the barn, Jack drifted to sleep with a newfound certainty. Clara was no longer just a visitor or a helper. She was someone he trusted, someone he cared for deeply, and someone who had changed the course of his life forever. The storm had passed, but the change within Jack had just begun. The winters slowly began to loosen its grip on the Harris ranch. Snow still covered the hills in thick layers, sparkling under the clear sunlight. But the days were longer, and the air had a faint hint of spring. The storm had passed, leaving a silence that felt different from before. Not cold or lonely, but calm and full of possibility. Jack and Clara had settled into a rhythm on the ranch, working together seamlessly, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Jack noticed changes in himself that surprised him. He no longer felt the sharp sting of solitude in the quiet moments. Instead, he felt a warm presence in the barn, in the fields, in the cabin. Clara's laughter, her quiet curiosity, and her gentle way of approaching every task had softened something deep inside him, a part of his heart he had kept carefully guarded for decades. One morning, as the first light of dawn painted the snowy hills in shades of gold and pink, Jack walked outside to check on the animals. Clara followed, carrying buckets of feed. The frost sparkled on her hair, and Jack felt an unexpected warmth spread through him just from seeing her. He had spent years alone, believing that independence was all he needed. Now he understood that sharing his life didn't weaken him. It made him stronger. "Jack, look at this little one," Clara called, pointing to a newborn calf lying in the straw. Its small body was trembling, and its mother nuzzled it gently. Jack approached, smiling. "She's healthy," he said, checking the calf carefully. "And she's lucky to have a mother like that." Clara smiled back, her eyes lighting up. "Just like we're lucky to have each other," she said softly, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. He looked at her, realizing that he didn't need to deny his feelings any longer. Over the next few weeks, their days passed in a mix of work, shared meals, and quiet evenings by the fire. Jack taught Clara more about the ranch, showing her how to mend fences, care for sick animals, and manage the land. She asked questions, learned quickly, and brought her own ideas and energy to the routines he had followed for decades. Jack found himself admiring her intelligence and resourcefulness. She was not only a partner in work, but also a companion in thought and spirit. Despite their closeness, Jack's old stubbornness occasionally surfaced. He found himself resisting the thought that his life could change so completely. He had been alone for so long that the idea of letting someone fully into his world felt strange, almost frightening. Yet every time he looked at Clara helping a horse, laughing at a small mishap, or simply sipping her coffee by the fire, he felt a sense of completeness he had never known. One evening, after the sun had dipped behind the hills and the sky turned a deep shade of blue, Jack and Clara sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the snow glisten in the moonlight. The silence was peaceful, filled with a quiet intimacy that neither had experienced before. "Jack," Clara said softly, breaking the silence, "do you ever think about the future?" Jack looked at her, surprised by the question. He had always lived in the present, focusing on the land and the animals, never imagining what lay ahead beyond the ranch. Sometimes, he admitted, but mostly, I've lived one day at a time. Clara reached for his hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. I think I'd like to be part of your future, if you'll let me. Jack's heart raced. He had spent years refusing the idea of companionship, telling himself he didn't need anyone. Yet now, here was the opportunity to embrace something he had never allowed himself to hope for. He looked into Clara's eyes, saw the sincerity, the warmth, the trust, and knew that his life had changed forever. Clara, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, I've spent so many years alone, thinking I didn't need anyone. But I see now that I was wrong. I don't just want you here. I want you with me, always. Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and a soft smile spread across her face. I've been hoping you'd say that, she whispered. I don't want to be anywhere else. From that moment, something shifted in their lives. The barn, the cabin, the ranch, they were no longer just places of work and survival. They became a home filled with laughter, warmth, and love. Jack found joy in simple moments, sharing meals with Clara, walking through the snow-covered fields, caring for the animals together. He realized that life was richer when shared, and that love did not diminish his independence, but enhanced it. The villagers noticed the change as well. Jack, once a man of strict routines and solitude, now greeted neighbors with a smile, sometimes speaking of Clara's ideas or joking about her cleverness. The couple became admired not only for their hard work and dedication to the ranch, but also for the quiet, loving partnership they shared. Spring began to creep over the hills, melting the snow and revealing the green grass beneath. The animals thrived and the ranch felt alive in a new way. Jack and Clara worked side by side, planning the year ahead, caring for the land, and dreaming of the future together. Each day their bond deepened, built on shared respect, trust, and affection. One afternoon, while repairing a fence on the far side of the ranch, Jack paused and looked at Clara, who was tying a post securely. The sun caught her hair, making it glow like gold, and the gentle breeze carried the faint scent of pine and thawing earth. Jack realized that he couldn't imagine life without her. The walls he had built around his heart had fallen, and in their place was a warmth he had never known. Clara, he said, approaching her slowly, I think it's time we stop pretending this is just friendship. I need you in my life, completely. Clara turned to him, eyes wide with understanding. Jack, I've wanted that from the start, she said softly. I just didn't know if you'd ever see it. Jack smiled, a rare, full smile that reached his eyes. I see it now, and I never want to be without you. From that day forward, they were inseparable. The Harris Ranch became not only a place of work, but a home filled with love, laughter, and partnership. Jack no longer felt the sting of solitude, and Clara found a place where she truly belonged. Together they faced the challenges of ranch life, celebrated the joys of small successes, and built a life richer and fuller than either had imagined alone. Neighbors often remarked on how the ranch seemed brighter now, how laughter carried from the barn into the fields, and how the two of them worked together with ease and joy. Jack, once a man who had refused companionship, now embraced it fully. He learned that love was not a complication to fear, but a gift to cherish. As the sun set over the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Jack and Clara stood together on the porch, hands entwined. The ranch stretched before them, alive and thriving, a testament to their hard work, resilience, and shared love. Jack realized that the life he had once cherished alone now felt complete with Clara by his side. He no longer feared change or vulnerability. Instead, he welcomed them, knowing that love, trust, and companionship had made him stronger, happier, and more alive than he had ever been. And for the first time in his life, Jack Harris, the stubborn, independent cowboy, looked forward to the future with excitement and hope, confident that he and Clara would face every storm, every challenge, and every joy together. The snow of winter had passed, but the warmth of love remained, filling the Harris Ranch with a new kind of life, one built not on solitude, but on connection, trust, and the unshakable bond between two hearts who had found each other when they least expected it. And so Jack and Clara's story continued, a story of resilience, courage, and love, proving that even the most independent hearts can find happiness when they allow someone else to share the journey. The ranch, once a symbol of solitude, had become a symbol of home, partnership, and a future filled with promise.